It's from Isaiah 37, and it is regarding Hezekiah. The passage picks up at a point where Hezekiah has received a bad news letter of impending doom. And maybe we're not under impending doom, but the current circumstances of our UMC have felt like a bad news letter that we've continued to receive over and over again. So here's what Hezekiah did with his bad news letter. And I offer this to you as a pattern for what we do with the difficult circumstances that we find ourselves in. After Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it, he went up to the Lord's temple and spread it out in prayer before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed this prayer before the Lord. O Lord of heaven's armies, God of Israel, you are enthroned between the mighty cherubim. You alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You alone created the heavens and the earth. Bend down, O Lord, and listen. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see. Rescue us. Then all the kingdoms of the earth will know that you alone are God. And then this, a few verses later, this is the hope that was offered to Hezekiah by Isaiah. Here is how you will know that what I say is true. This year you will eat only what grows up by itself, and next year you will eat what springs up from that. But in the third year you will plant crops and harvest them. You will tend vineyards and eat their fruit. And you who are left in Judah will have escaped the ravages of the siege. You will put down roots in your own soil and grow up and flourish. For a remnant of my people will spread out from Jerusalem, a group of survivors from Mount Zion. The passionate commitment of the Lord of heaven's armies will make this happen. And Keith is with us now. Keith is husband, father, grandfather, ordained elder in the Virginia Conference. He's a former attorney, I guess still is an attorney, a former practicing attorney. And Keith currently serves as the president of the Global Wesleyan Covenant Association organization. So that is Keith Boyette, and we will be blessed to hear from you in a few short.
One of the great things about being president of the WCA is you get to travel a lot. That's also one of the not so great things, okay? But I've been to so many places, and I've seen the richness of the people called Methodist, the talent that is amongst the people called Methodist. And one of the joys of a time like this is I started not at the farthest point in Mississippi, but at Hattiesburg. And I've had the joy of traveling with Hugh and Linda yesterday and today, and being in different places and seeing the wonderful diversity of Mississippi. I want to thank Hugh and Linda for your hospitality and graciousness and putting up with me over the last 2 days. And David, thank you for making this facility available, for your leadership. Grateful for the membership of this church. And for all of you that are members of the WCA, let me say thank you. Without you, we would not be able to accomplish the work that God has called us to. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is give you an overview. Now, I spoke at a Sunday school class this morning at Batesville First United Methodist Church, and I think I set a new record in giving an overview. I think I did it in about 8 minutes, okay? But you're going to get a little bit fuller version here this afternoon. I'm not going to assume that we're all at the same place in understanding or knowing what's happening. And so for some of you, there'll be some things that you'll say, oh, I already know that. And I just ask you to be patient as I work through it for those who maybe are hearing it for the first time. I'm going to basically address sort of three things. Where have we come from recently? I'm not going to go all the way back to the beginning of this story, but where have we come from recently? What is on the horizon for General Conference 2020? And what is the WCA doing to prepare both for that and what's going to be after that? And I want to allow plenty of time for questions. So be thinking of your questions. Everything is fair game. As it says, I'm an attorney, so I'm used to being under pressure, okay? I don't mind you asking hard questions, and I'll do the best I can to answer those questions. But that's where I really want to spend our time, because I want you to get what you need walking out of here. You don't need to hear what I think you need. You need to hear what you need to hear, and I want to know that. So I'm a person who constantly seeks after God for him to reveal things to me that I'm not going to know in my normal everyday walk. And God meets me at different points and in different ways. And one of the ways he did it was my flight into Mississippi was delayed on Friday night, and I did not get to the hotel in Hattiesburg until 1:30 in the morning, Saturday morning. And the Griffiths were picking me up at 8:30, and so you can see my sleep time was compressed. And maybe it was because I was sleep deprived, but when I woke up on Saturday morning, God was speaking to me in volumes, both about a message that I'm going to be bringing in Tulsa, but about these 2 days. And what God impressed upon me in those early morning hours was that we're in a period as a church that I would characterize as a dark night of the soul. Now, some of you have heard that. Some of you heard that expression. I've never heard it applied corporately, but individuals go through dark nights of the soul. A dark night of the soul is not something that's necessarily bad. It doesn't feel good when you're going through it. A dark night of the soul can happen when you've drifted away from God and you begin to experience that separation from God, which has a beneficial effect of turning you back toward God, okay? That's one thing. Another time of dark night of the soul is a time of preparation. It's almost as if you're pregnant. I've never been pregnant. I've watched my wife be pregnant. But so you ladies know what I'm talking about. But it's a pregnant time when God is doing something in preparation for what's next. So most of us would say, I never want to experience a dark night of the soul. But what I'm trying to show you is that there's benefits to a dark night of the soul. But that's kind of the season that I feel that we're in as a church. And how we're experiencing this season depends greatly upon our context, where we are in ministry. And so I get to see the full panoply of that. I've been to Zimbabwe twice in the last 6 weeks. So I've been to Africa, and I've met with our African brothers and sisters, and I'm going to kind of put them over here. And the way I'm going to describe them is, they look at us and they say, you Christians from America, you sent missionaries. And they came to Africa, and they shared God's word with us. And they shared the whole counsel of God. They shared the entirety of the Bible. And they taught us the principles that our church stands for. And among those was marriage was defined as being between one man and one woman, holy covenant. And that there were certain standards for ordaining those who would be our spiritual leaders. And we understood that to be firmly rooted and grounded in the revealed word of God. And as far as we're concerned, that's settled. I mean, we've changed our lives to conform to that, many of us. We understood that. But now the church in America is coming and saying, oh, don't believe or listen to any of that stuff that our forebears taught you. Okay, and they're saying, no, we're not going to do that. So they're very committed to a traditional understanding of the Christian faith. And they're also very committed to the unity of our church. In the United Methodist Church, they're committed to that name. So hear that. Those aren't separate things. Those are together. And so their view of what happened at General Conference 2019 is, we were told that we were going to address the presenting issue once and for all. We were going to devote concentrated time to it. We're not going to take up any other business. We're going to bring the best minds in the church together and have them meet and have them come up with a plan to address this once for all, so we would be freed to be able to go on with the important ministry that the church is called to. You all heard that too, right? And they participated in that. They came to St. Louis. They believed that the church corporately discerned what should be the way we move forward, and they celebrate what was decided because what they had heard from the missionaries, what they have discovered for themselves, was what was affirmed and validated in St. Louis. And they went back to Africa, and they thought we were ready to move on. And so to them, what's unfolding here in America is a complete shock. They cannot even fathom what's happening here in the United States, and they are befuddled by what's going to happen at the 2020 General Conference. In fact, they're angry about what's about to happen in Minneapolis because they really don't want to deal with this battle anymore. Okay, so that's them. Now, then you've got traditionalists who are in very progressive annual conferences. Okay, that's their context. They are trying to live faithfully committed to the traditional historic teachings of the church in an environment where they are under attack constantly. Bob Kaler, who serves on the Global WCA Council, is a pastor of Tri-Lakes United Methodist Church in the Mountain Sky Conference. His bishop is Karen Oliveto. And he's at a place where he's saying, I know what they did in St. Louis, but it has not changed what I'm experiencing or what my congregation is experiencing in the least. We are constantly under attack. We are told that we are mean-spirited, that we're hateful, all of those sorts of things. There is no way I can tolerate or be part of this anymore. It is spiritually oppressive to me. Now, all of us are somewhere in between here. And depending on where we are, our patience with what is going on is at different levels. And in fact, even in this room, some of you are identifying with Bob even though you're not experiencing that. You're like, this has gone on too long. It is time for this to be resolved. And other people maybe still are hoping that something will work out to hold this church that most of us have known for all our lives together and right the ship of state, keep it from sinking and all of that. So it's in this environment that we come together. I think it was probably naive of us to think that General Conference 2019 was going to resolve this. That was a false promise that was put out by those who were pushing that kind of agenda. Because the 47% that voted against what was adopted in St. Louis, they were not satisfied with that, and they were not going to give up, and they want another bite at the apple. And so if we go down that road, Minneapolis becomes St. Louis 2. It becomes Groundhog Day for us. And I don't know anyone who wants to live through that again or sees anything productive about it. We come out of General Conference 2019. The leaders of the groups that advanced the One Church plan, which, as I think most of you know, would have changed our historic teachings, would have removed changed our definition of marriage, changed our ordination standards, and would have basically said that each local church and each annual conference could decide how they were going to move forward according to whatever they believed. In other words, my way of paraphrasing that is each person does what is right in their own eyes, and I think the Bible has a lot to say about that. But those people were shocked, embarrassed, and angry by what happened at General Conference. They believed that they were going to prevail, and they told everyone that they were going to prevail, and they didn't. And you saw the response that occurred. I don't know what happened here specifically in Mississippi, but in many of our annual conferences, pastors and churches took out full-page ads in major newspapers apologizing for our church and its position and the decisions that were made in St. Louis. They said that they would violate those decisions. They would be in disobedience to them. Leaders of our church issued calls saying that they were going to stay and resist. Bishops were complicit in this, in that they either joined in those protests or they communicated clearly that they would not enforce the discipline of our church if there were violations of it. And the whole basis for this was the belief that if they stayed and resisted, there would be, that we, the traditionalists, would become so frustrated with the dysfunction of our church that we would simply leave. Okay? And it's not a bad strategy, because many of us did become very frustrated at the very open defiance and dysfunction of our church. And we began to question, do we continue to pay our apportionments? Hugh referenced the response of those who were for a change in the church withholding apportionments. Well, there were churches on our side and leaders on our side who began to say, I'm not going to support. Satan is having a field day here, isn't he? He's going to town in what's happening. And so if we go to Minneapolis in this context, we're just going to simply, yet again, damage the church, damage our witness as Christians, and not solve anything. We are truly deadlocked. I mean, in a presidential election or a regional election of 53-47%, that's a pretty significant difference voting. But it came down to really, if a handful of delegates had changed their vote, it would have been a different outcome. That's how close it is. So the context of our church right now, and by the way, I mean, our bishops, they came firmly out in support of the One Church plan, and they were overwhelmingly rebuffed, essentially, and they now know that their leadership, to whatever extent it was there, has been rejected. And they have basically now abdicated their responsibility to provide leadership for the church. They don't know how to lead our church out of this anymore, okay? And so we have an absence of leadership. We have a system that is not working, that's dysfunctional, and we have no one who really seems to know. And by the way, we've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of our money given to the church on this purpose. Okay, so now we're headed toward Minneapolis, and there are plans that are being advanced towards what will happen in Minneapolis. And so I'm going to give you a broad overview of those plans, and you can ask me to go much deeper as you're interested. There were portions of what was adopted in St. Louis that reaffirmed our church's teachings and sought to improve our accountability that were not adopted. So there's the traditional plan was adopted. It's no longer the traditional plan. It is the discipline of our church. But there were parts of the traditional plan that did not get adopted that are now filed to be voted on at 2020. I got to tell you that if we are successful in adopting those provisions, it will not change what happens in our church. We will have doubled down, but we will have bishops who still will not enforce those provisions. The elections here in the United States, Mississippi would be an exception to what happened in many annual conferences. The slates that were elected were predominantly centrist and progressives. Now, the narrative out there is, whoa, look what the response was. The percentages are basically the same as in 2016, okay? So the centrist and progressives haven't made any progress in the global church in changing things, but what they have established is that they are firmly in control of the bureaucracy and institution of our church. So we come together for jurisdictional conferences in the summer of 2020, and new bishops will be elected, and they're going to be elected by these persons who were elected as delegates. And there are not enough traditional delegates elected in jurisdictions in the United States to elect a single traditional bishop. Okay? It takes 60% to elect a bishop. And so what that means is the bishops are already in defiance of our discipline, and the new ones who will be elected will be of that ilk, and they're going to be younger, and they're going to be in those offices for many years. So in order for us to effectuate change within the United Methodist Church, it will take generations for that to occur. And we would have to endure a lot of defiance and resistance, and we would have to hold countless trials, expend incredible amounts of resources in order to bring the kind of accountability that's needed. It could be done, but hey, that's not the character of us as Methodists. We are not people who go out on hunts to kick people out of the church. We are grace-filled, mercy-driven people, but we expect when people take vows that they're going to live out those vows. And we're in a situation where there's defiance. But that's the traditional plan. And one way you could look at the traditional plan that will be in Minneapolis is it's a plan that would say, progressives, you leave, okay? But the progressives, by and large, have never left. And I don't believe they will leave. They will have to be forced out. And I think that's almost impossible to happen. Okay, that's that plan. Now then you may be familiar that there's a group within the church led by Adam Hamilton, who is the pastor at the Church of Resurrection in Kansas City. It's called Next. And they were the chief proponents for the One Church plan. And they have put legislation into the hopper for General Conference 2020 that is called Next Generation UMC. Okay? And their proposal is, we lost in St. Louis. We're going to put basically the same plan forward again, where we want to remove all of the restrictive provisions in the discipline, change the definition of marriage, change our ordination standards, let each church and annual conference decide what they're going to do. And but this time, the little change we're going to make is traditionalists who don't want to stay part of that kind of church can vote to leave. So this is basically traditionalists leave. And if the traditionalists leave, we might give them some parting gift, some monetary amount to grease the tracks as they leave, so to speak. So do you see, if those are the two plans that we're going to vote on in Minneapolis, it's just a repeat of St. Louis. And who knows? My prediction is that it would come out basically the same, because the global percentages of delegates are basically the same, and Africa is solidly with us on the traditional position, and they will be more than happy to vote for this, and the Next plan will be defeated. But do you see the futility of that? That doesn't help us at all. We win, but we lose, in a sense. So in the immediate aftermath of St. Louis, I picked up the phone and I began calling people across the church. I believe that you don't resolve these things in the way we're resolving them. That you got to get people at the same table and you have to start talking to one another. And so I identified leaders across the country who had already begun to talk about separation. And Kent Millard, who is the president of United Theological Seminary, and Darren Cushman Wood, who is the pastor of a large church in Indianapolis, Indiana, that's a Reconciling Ministries church. Those two individuals, first they dropped the phone when I called them because they Keith Boyette is calling me. Why does Keith Boyette want to talk to me? But after they got over their shock, they said, we will risk and we'll sit down at the table with you. And a group of other individuals who we each recruited gathered together. None of them are leaders in the sense of, Adam Hamilton or that kind of thing. They're people who are recognized in the church, but they met as individuals. And between late June and early September, we did the hard work of negotiating an amicable separation for the United Methodist Church. And that has been put forward as the Indianapolis Plan for Amicable Separation. The reason why it's called the Indianapolis Plan was because we met in Indianapolis. They have pictures of me sitting in the conference room of a Reconciling Ministries church, okay? But here, the spirit in which this was done, we cannot be in a situation where there are winners and losers. I mean, we could be, but do you see how destructive that would be if we are going to insist that we're going to be in the position of winners and losers? We cannot be in a position where some people stay and other people leave, because we're constantly going to fight over who stays and who leaves. So the Indianapolis Plan for Amicable Separation lays out a plan in which we all essentially leave. It would create 2 and perhaps 3 entirely separate and distinct denominations that would emerge from the United Methodist Church. They are not tied together by any kind of umbrella. They have no financial entanglement at all. They have entirely distinct leadership. They will have their own disciplines that are independent of the other one. Okay, so it is a true separation. And I'm saying that because I've gotten some pushback from people saying, oh, this is the one church plan all over again. Well, you can see it's not. I defined the one church plan. Oh, this is the Central Conference plan. The Connectional Conference plan. It's not that, because that was silos under an umbrella of the United Methodist Church. This is real separation that gets us away from the conflict. One of the denominations that would emerge would be a traditional United Methodist Church, or a traditional Methodist church. It would uphold the current teachings of our discipline. It would have the high view of Scripture that we as traditionalists have. It would hold to all the core teachings that have been part of the historic Christian faith in the Wesleyan tradition. There would be what we are calling for placeholder, a centrist Methodist church, which would adopt the position of the UMNext people, okay? And if they could get their act together, and there was a group that wanted to form a purely progressive church that mandated marriage being performed in churches, and mandated the ordination of self-avowed practicing homosexuals in covenanted relationships, they could do that. So there's the possibility for that occurring. So what would happen then is it would bring a level of clarity and certainty for our churches, in that each church, at first each annual conference would make a decision as to which of these denominations they would align with, that they would move to. Now, I don't know Mississippi as well as you know Mississippi, but from my conversations, I think it'd be fairly accurate to say the odds would be that Mississippi would vote as an annual conference to align with a traditional expression that would emerge, a traditional denomination. And if that occurred, traditional local churches in Mississippi would not have to take a vote. They would move with their annual conference into this new traditional denomination, okay? If by some chance Mississippi voted to be part of the centrist denomination that would change our teachings and all, then local churches would have, if they didn't want to go that direction, could have a vote. And if they voted to be part of a traditional denomination, even though their annual conference went that way, they would be permitted to join the traditional denomination. Now, importantly, churches, as they moved, would take their property with them. So the big hang-up that is really keeping us stuck, where local churches are concerned about what happens to their real property, that would be answered. Additionally, the other thing that would happen, churches that moved into these new denominations would move into them without the necessity of paying financial resources to address unfunded pension liability, which could be as much as 5 to 6 times your annual apportionments if a church goes independent, okay? So it answers that question. It allows churches to move into a denomination and not have to address unfunded pension liability. That liability basically moves with the church into the new denomination it would be part of, and that new denomination will care for that. There's a lot of other provisions about in the Indianapolis plan that I could go into, and I will if you asked questions that would lead deeper in there. But one of the big things that we had to negotiate was, okay, what is the percentage vote required to choose that alignment? Now this is important because the centrist and progressives argued for it to be 2/3 vote. And the reason they argue for that is this is an important decision. It ought to be a supermajority. And they can make some pretty good arguments there. But we argued that it should be a simple majority, 50% plus 1. And that's what the Indianapolis plan calls for, that it would be 50% plus 1. Now, this is going to be a hard decision in many churches. I don't know any of our churches that are univocal in this. So there, wherever you put the vote, there's going to be people who are happy and people who are upset. But can you imagine if the vote is 2/3 and you get a congregation that votes 64% to align with, say, the traditional denomination, but they can't, and so they're stuck in the centrist denomination. The majority voted they wanted to be somewhere else. That's going to destroy that church. So that's why it's so important for it to be 50%. The Indianapolis plan is not perfect. It's a compromise. If you've ever been in a negotiation and you compromise, nobody's happy. Everybody's upset about something, but everybody's glad that the fight is finally over. We cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so we've rolled out the Indianapolis plan. The WCA Council at a meeting earlier this week endorsed the Indianapolis plan. That's what we're working toward. I'll be glad to answer. It's not perfect, and I'll be more than happy to talk about how it's not perfect and all of that. You can ask questions about that. So the final thing in preparations for GC 2020 is that late in the summer, a few Central Conference bishops said, we're going to step forward and we're going to see if we can make something happen. And so they called a meeting at which there were representatives of the traditional side of the church, the centrist part of the church. And by the way, I hate these names, but they're the names that we use, and so shorthand requires it. The centrist part of the church and the progressive part of the church. And out of that came a commitment for a smaller group representing each of those groups, plus Central Conference bishops, plus U.S. bishops, to participate in what is now being called a mediated negotiation, okay? A professional mediator. I'm not at liberty to share the person's name because we're under confidentiality with respect to that, but very, very highly regarded, has made the mediator's services available to the church. They're not United Methodist, made their services available to see if they can help the church reach some kind of negotiated agreement on separation. Basically, the two plans that are there for negotiation are the Next Generation Plan and the Indianapolis Plan, which is already a compromise amongst the different elements. We had our first intense meeting on Monday and Tuesday of this week. I entered that meeting thinking that there was no likelihood it would go anywhere. I came out of that meeting with some hope. And that there'll be further meetings of this group in the next month. And if it comes to some unanimous agreement, then it will be presented as the recommendation of leaders of all of the major groups within the church, which could be huge in ending this, but need that. Okay, so the final thing I want to touch on, and then we'll go to questions, is what has the WCA been doing and what is our plan? It's really interesting to watch what has been on display as we've gone through this. Traditionalists are very thoughtful, very methodical, very strategic. I mean, we formed the WCA 3 years ago because we saw what was coming down the pike, and we knew that we needed to be positioned to provide leadership for our part of the church. The progressives, they have a goal, but they don't have any idea how to get there, okay? And so we're the only part of the church, literally, that is ready, if we need to step out with a new denomination. And that's never been our hope. That's never been our dream. We wanted the United Methodist Church to be healed, to recommit to its historic teachings, and for it to move forward. But we have been preparing for the worst case scenario. And so our Global Legislative Assembly last year approved the formation of a Next Steps task force to put together a plan if we needed to launch a new denomination. And that task force met over 2.5 months and prepared a draft document, which is called a Book of Doctrines and Discipline. Notice the different name from our current document. We have said the most important thing we have to get right is the doctrine of the church, and it needs to be up front and center, and it needs to be what we're held accountable to, the teachings of the church. It needs to be what our bishops focus on, our leaders focus on. And so that group has prepared a Book of Doctrines and Discipline, which is a recommendation which has been reviewed by the WCA Council, and in about 3 weeks, we will be making it available to the delegates to the Legislative Assembly and to the church at large. Now, I want to say something briefly about that book. We have no authority. We can't arrogate to ourselves the creation of a new denomination. Who appointed Keith Boyette and elected him to do this? So hear this. We are seeking to serve the traditional side of the church and say, here is some thinking. We give it to you. You who will be the convening delegates of a new denomination. You can choose this to be your starting place. You can change it. You can come up with something entirely different. But we've done the hard work of trying to think through some of these things. So this is not something that is determined and that can't be changed. It's not even wet cement at this point. It is the ingredients to make wet cement. And when we present it to you and everyone else, we desperately want your criticism, your comments, your good thinking about whether it's a good thing or not a good thing. But we're prepared to, as we're given permission to, we're prepared to lead into that. I hope you hear the spirit in which I'm saying that. We've done the hard work. If it's affirmed by people, good to go. If it's not, we just want to serve our movement, okay? The folks that we have allegiance with. Okay, the final thing I'll say, and I'm more than happy to answer questions about that Book of Doctrine and Discipline, and I can anticipate the kind of questions. Well, are you going to have bishops? You know, what about trust clauses? Is there going to be a trust clause in this new thing? I got answers for all that, okay? At least what we're proposing. Now, the final thing I would say is there will be separation in May of 2020. This church cannot continue. The finances are going through the floor. All you have to do is look at the reports that are coming from every annual conference, and the arrows on the graph are just going like that. We are hemorrhaging members in churches. Attendance is plummeting. People are voting with their feet, okay? This church cannot continue and do this for another 4 years. And yet, if you were to ask me if I were a betting man, what would I put money on? I would tell you, historical performance tells me that we are very adept at making no decision. We have not had a successful general conference since 2008. 2012 didn't do anything. 2016 didn't do anything. 2019 didn't get the problem done. The phrase I hear most often is the United Methodist Church just going to kick the can down the road again? So the level of frustration in all corners of the church are such that I don't believe the church can navigate beyond May of 2020. So separate, and by the way, in this mediated negotiation, even before we got to the confidential stage, every constituency agreed that separation was the only way to resolve the impasse in the church. The U.S. bishops, the Central Conference bishops, and the leaders of these three factions in our church. Separation will occur. It will either be a soft separation, and now you're going to hear me sound like an English politician, and Brexit, okay? It will either be a soft separation or a hard separation. The soft separation will be if General Conference adopts one of these plans and lays out a process of separation that our churches can navigate and that minimizes the negatives for the local church. Hard separation will be if it does nothing and tries to kick down the can down the road. And if that happens, if that's what happens, the WCA is prepared to offer the church a new path forward for those parts of the church that elect to move in that direction. It will be hard because you'll have to risk. You won't know what's going to happen to the property of your church. Now, the likelihood is that if enough churches move at the same time, the annual conferences do not have the resources for sustained legal battles, and they can't pay the debt service on churches that have debt, and it will be a nightmare of administration for them, and they don't have the resources to do that administration. But it's a risk that would have to be taken. It will be costly in that sense, but it will be that kind of decision that churches will be faced with. But as I was talking to a pastor of a church in the Midwest, it's a pretty good-sized church, and he said to me, my board has already made the decision. We will be leaving the United Methodist Church. We're going to wait around and hope that something sane comes out of General Conference. But if it doesn't, our airplane's taken off. We just want to know that there's going to be an airport for us to land at. Will the WCA be that airport? And I personally am committed to our being that airport if it's needed. So thank you for your patience in listening to all that. I am now ready to be cross-examined by you guys. Hugh is going to grab, or David is going to have a microphone here. Yeah, I see someone's already ready. Great. Please, if you'd tell me your name.
There we go. I'm not real clear about the progressive position. I think I understand the other two, but would you talk about the progressive as compared to the other two?
Sure. Well, what the progressives would say is that our church's teachings are completely wrong, that marriage should not be defined as being between one man and one woman, that it should be defined as being between two persons, including those of the same gender, and that every pastor who is a pastor in our church should be obligated to perform and bless such ceremonies, so that it would completely change the teachings. The centrist position is, well, we're fine with those kinds of weddings, but we shouldn't mandate pastors who don't hold to that having to do it. So if the progressive position was adopted, you would be required to perform such services. You wouldn't have it would be a chargeable offense for you to refuse to perform such a service. And annual conferences would be required to ordain LGBT persons who are in covenanted relationships with members of their same gender, okay? Would not have an option. It would be a chargeable offense if they refused to ordain such persons for that reason alone. Okay, so it's the centrists are live and let live, I guess you'd say. Okay, your obligation would be as a pastor, if a same gendered couple presented themselves to you, you would have the option to say, I can't do it, but I'll refer you to another Methodist pastor who might do it, okay? But the progressive position would mandate that. Now, I need to say in this, by the way, this is not the issue before the church, what our definition of marriage is going to be and what our ordination state. I mean, that's the presenting issue. But the issue before our church is, what is the gospel? Who is Jesus Christ? What is the Word of God? What is the authority of Scripture? What does it mean to be saved? What is salvation? What is sanctification? All of the core doctrines of the church are involved here. But the issue that we're debating in our generation is this human sexuality issue. Yeah, it has. Oh, and by the way, this has been the battle of every generation. Ours just happens to be around sexuality, but every other generation has had to battle over these core.
All talk about relations.
Right, right.
Thanks for being here, Keith.
Yes.
Stephen Biddick. 2 questions while I'm up. Number one, maybe something I read erroneously, but you talked about the 50+1 vote in the Indianapolis plan regarding the conference. If a local church chooses not to go the way of their conference, am I not true that would require a larger vote, 2/3, or is it still 50+1?
In the Indianapolis plan, it's 50% plus 1.
Excellent.
And that vote can either be the charge conference, which of course is the leadership of the church, or it can be a church conference at which all professing members can vote, and it would be 50% plus 1 of those present and voting. And so just to unpack that a little bit, in many of our churches that are traditionally minded, the church leadership lines up with the people, the general congregation. And so you just go ahead and have a charge conference and vote this and not have everyone have to come out and debate this and decide it. But our clergy as a whole tend to be more centrist or progressive than our congregations. And so in some congregations, what has happened is the leadership of the church that has been put in place under the leadership of the pastor tends to be more liberal than the congregation as a whole. And so in those churches, the safety valve is that the congregation can say, no, we want to vote. We don't want to leave this to the charge conference. So,
Good deal. Hey, I bet you would have like a lot higher percentage at charge conference if you're I'm just saying. Also, don't be under any delusion, any of you lay people who don't go to annual conference. Keith, this is not nearly as conservative a conference as you might think.
okay.
Second question, and I'm done, and that is related to the book of
Doctrine
and Discipline, going back to the original Wesleyan roots. I like that. What about the bishops?
Okay. I wondered, I had a bet on how long it would be before that question came up. You made it really quick. The Book of Doctrine and Discipline envisions the continuation of the episcopal office, but radically changed. We propose a term-limited office, 12-year term limit. So people are not elected to bishops for life. Persons are not elected as bishops in jurisdictional or regional areas. Each annual conference can nominate 2 persons to be in a pool for consideration by the Global General Conference. Persons will be elected from that pool into a Episcopal candidates pool. So they're people who are eligible to be bishops in the church. If the Mississippi Annual Conference, as an example, had an Episcopal vacancy, its Committee on Episcopacy could go to that pool and say, this is the person we want to be our bishop. And that person is only ordained as a bishop once they are entered into an agreement with that annual conference to be their bishop. They are subject to annual evaluations by the Committee on Episcopacy of that conference and the Global Committee on Episcopacy. And when they leave that position as bishop of a particular annual conference, if they are not retained by another annual conference, they immediately cease to be a bishop and they return to the general clergy of the church. Their accountability, I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said, Mitch. Yes. And then now you're starting to get into other areas. Clergy are not limited to only serving within the annual conference of their ordination. So they might end up being a pastor in another annual conference, but they would return to being a pastor. Their accountability is no longer to their peers, okay? So it's not bishops judging other bishops, but they are accountable to the Global Committee on Episcopacy, which has an equal number of laity and clergy serving on it. Laity have not been involved in the past in holding bishops accountable. Well, bishops haven't been held accountable. So this is something new, to hold them accountable. If they have a moral failure themselves, their accountability will be to their annual conference of ordination. But on their administration of the discipline and all of that, it will be at a global level. Their job description will be substantially different, focusing much more on the teaching office of the bishop. They will be the ones who teach the doctrine of the church and empower pastors, help pastors teach the doctrine of the church. They'll be responsible for the training and raising up of leadership, both in the local church and in the conference. They'll be responsible for articulating and advancing the vision and mission of that annual conference. They will have a much more apostolic role than our bishops do right now. They will not be persons who spend the great bulk of their time in administrative responsibilities outside of the area, the geographic area that they're to be part of. And so we're trying to enable bishops to be much more effective. That's some of the things about bishops.
Don Lewis, retired clergy of the Mississippi Conference. Keith, thank you so much for your leadership and your commitment to the Lord and to the church.
Thank you.
You shared with us that negotiations are still in progress. My question is, once those negotiations are completed and a plan is realized or formulated, will it be presented to the Judicial Council prior to the 2020 General Conference? Because I see what happened in 2016.
Sure.
The Judicial Council said everything that the General Conference did in 2016 is not valid.
That was in 2012, but you're right.
2012.
Yeah, with
Thank
Plan UMC. And that's an excellent question. The Indianapolis Plan authors, the 12 of us, have requested that the Council of Bishops submit the Indianapolis Plan legislation to the Judicial Council for a ruling before the May General Conference. The only body in the church that can ask for that kind of ruling before General Conference convenes is the Council of Bishops. That's by discipline. They're the only ones empowered to ask for that. Likewise, the persons involved in the mediated negotiation that I referenced, we have also already said that if something emerges from that, we would ask the Council of Bishops to seek that ruling. So that would be the hope. I believe the Council of Bishops will take us up on that. If they don't, then the delegates to General Conference can request that kind of ruling on the first day of General Conference, but that puts the Judicial Council under tremendous pressure. And because I see this as leading off from your question, I'm going to share this additional piece of information. For those of you that don't know, General Conference spends about the first half of its time, the first 5 days, meeting in legislative committees, and then the second 5 days meeting as all the delegates together to debate whatever has come out of those legislative committees. And petitions are the way that legislation gets before General Conference, and petitions are assigned to different legislative committees depending on their subject matter. Now, this becomes important because the Indianapolis Plan is in one petition, which means it will go to one legislative committee and not be debated in a bunch of legislative committees. The Next Generation UMC Plan is in 14 different petitions, and it will go to many different legislative committees, which makes its path much more complicated, because one legislative committee can recommend one of those petitions, and another legislative committee can not recommend another petition, and so it can make it very complicated. Our goal in the mediated negotiation is to have a single petition that will present everything, and that will make the Judicial Council review easier, which is why I piggybacked on your question. So, other questions? Thank you, David, for, yeah, he's coming. David is doing a great job of spotting and moving about, so.
My name's Richard Guest. I'm a pretty new Methodist. I don't know much about the Methodist Church, but
We're glad you're a new Methodist.
But I love this church, and that's why I'm a Methodist. Been here. About three things you said. One of them was, no matter what the vote, 50% or 2/3% vote, somebody's going to be really mad, and it's going to really, the church will maybe just fall apart, I guess. You know, with 2/3, that's a lot of people that are going to be mad. And my second thing was, being from Mississippi down here and being a very conservative, I always visualize California people and New York people being the progressives and all these other words that you're using. And according to what he said, it sounds like we have a lot more maybe in this church than I knew. So could you address maybe where all these people are that are opposed to the traditional views that we have today? And the last thing was, I was wondering why, if you break off your traditional, why don't you just keep what the Methodist Church has today as your background? But you keep going into more and more stuff that's going to be changed for them too, so it's very complicated. Tell you what you're saying.
Thank you. Those are excellent questions, and maybe your newness to the tribe gives you clarity that enables you to ask those questions that some others wouldn't have. So let me try to respond to that. You're right. If there's a vote required in local churches, in many local churches, that may result in some people being upset. Our ties to the church are through our local churches, though. And many people choose to be part of a local church and find community there. And it doesn't have anything to do with these kinds of differences. And they can navigate these differences as long as they maintain their relational ties. But you're right, if if a church is deeply conflicted, and if people have strongly held views on this, it could be divisive for a local church. There's just no way to avoid that because the conflict is ripping apart the larger church. And the larger church controls the destiny of our local churches right now. The second question, if I don't answer your question fully, either come back at me or see me afterwards. My flight doesn't leave until 9:30 tomorrow morning, so I've got a time. The second question was, okay, where are all these progressives? You're right in your general analysis that you would think that they're from some of the states that you mentioned, but that's not entirely true in the United Methodist Church. And as I mentioned, our clergy on a whole, they've been educated in seminaries that are very liberal in their theological outlooks. And so on the whole, our clergy are much more liberal than the people in our pews. And so, for example, someone yesterday who has been a teller at the Mississippi annual conference meetings and has participated in counting ballots on these kinds of issues said in his estimation that the clergy of this conference are divided about 50-50 between traditional and progressive. But he told me that his analysis of the lay vote was 95% traditional. So that kind of, and I don't, some of you other clergy here could either say yes or no on that. But in our society, on the presenting issue, our culture has shifted to being affirming and open to same-gender weddings and that sort of thing. And so our church, the progressives in our church, basically are arguing that our church ought to follow our culture and not the teachings of Scripture. And that is not something, and there's great pressure in that regard because those trends are occurring across our country, including in areas that you would characterize as more conservative. So it's not just a simple political analysis, I guess. And then I'm trying to remember your third question. Oh, yeah, right. So as I said, this presenting issue isn't the only thing that is at stake here in the future of the church. And so, for example, the disobedience of our bishops and their unwillingness to abide by the discipline of the church and the inability of the church to hold them accountable is a big issue that cannot be addressed in our current system. Many of the other things, if I were to take a vote here and say, ask for a show of hands and say, how many people here feel that the resources that you give to the church that are then sent on in the way of apportionments beyond the local church are being wisely administered and deployed? In other words, are our general boards and agencies serving the local church? I would suspect that most people here would say, we don't need the general boards and agencies. And that's about $125 to $140 million expenditure that we're doing each year. And so many people who are more traditional in their perspective would like to see a substantial reorganization of the general church so that we would not have so many boards and agencies. And so because of those kinds of things, people are saying that this is an opportunity for us to address some fundamental things that are not working in the church, and therefore we ought to do something new. Now, you make a great argument. In fact, there have been some leaders who have argued that we ought to just get us out of this church, leave everything the same otherwise, and make it really simple. And that may be what ultimately prevails in this. But I personally see this as I'm going to call it a catalytic moment. Someone once said, never waste a good crisis. because it creates opportunity to address things that we might not be able to address for generations. For me, what is non-negotiable are the core tenets of our faith. And everything else is the way we do the mission that we're doing and ought to be negotiable. But the core tenets of our church are non-negotiable for me. Thanks for your question. There's someone way back here, way over here.
And while I'm getting to them, just in terms of the 50-50 for the clergy, I think I would disagree with that.
Okay.
I'd say 65-35, somewhere around there, 65-ish.
65 being what?
65 conservative.
Conservative, okay.
Is that? I'll meet you halfway.
Okay, and after that, David, this lady up here has been holding up her hand, and I know that that's a long walk for you. So, oh, okay. We got another microphone now. Please, sir.
You mentioned about the seminary.
Yes.
And the teachings were generally, in your estimate, 50-50 with the liberal. And is anything...
That's not the seminaries. That was clergy voting at annual conference.
Understand.
Okay.
Okay. Is there anything to address, because you said that the teachings in seminary tend to be more on the progressive side. Is there anything planned to address the teachings in seminary that are producing our clergy to where if they continue to be more of the progressive side, they're going to populate the progressive side of the church? Is there any plans to address conservative teachings in seminary?
Yes. Okay, so the church itself does not have control over what a particular seminary teaches. But here's how that's impacted. Right now, the 13 official United Methodist seminaries are funded in part by something called the Ministerial Education Fund. So a portion of your apportionments go into this Ministerial Education Fund, and significant sums of money are given to these seminaries, and they largely survive because they receive those funds. And many of them have few to no United Methodist students in them, okay? If that goes away, those seminaries are not sustainable anymore, by and large. So what we are proposing in what would be new is we would change the funding for theological education for candidates for ministry in the new denomination. Instead of monies being paid to, quote, official seminaries, the monies would be given or directed to those candidates for ministry who have been approved in the new system. They would be service loans that would be forgiven after 5 years of service to the church. That does two things. First, most of our ministers come out of seminary with substantial debt that they have to contend with for perhaps 10 years, okay? Under this system, they would not come out of seminary with debt, because if they serve the church, those loans basically would be forgiven. Those students then determine where they're going to go to seminary. If they are students who have been, are candidates who have been vetted in terms of their theological understanding and positions and their adherence to the theological teachings of our church, they're more likely to choose to attend seminaries that are going to be aligned with their beliefs, which means those resources will go to seminaries that they attend that probably will be more theologically aligned with the teachings of the church. On the other side of it, like some other denominations, we are proposing that there be an international biblical and theological competency exam that persons have to take before they are ordained in the church. Now that tests knowledge, understanding of both of our biblical interpretation and our theological positions. Now, all of us know we can study hard for a test, and we can pass the test, even though we don't necessarily agree with the facts. So there will still be the interview process and all of that, but in some ways this is like a bar examination. This wasn't my idea, okay? But it's like a bar examination for lawyers. And law students, when they're making decisions about what law school they're going to go to, one of the things they look at is what is the track record of that law school in their graduates passing bar examinations. And so likewise, students, I believe, will start to look and say, well, how did the students from this seminary do when they take the biblical and theological competency exam? So there's not, and clearly there will be seminaries that the new denomination will promote. And so seminaries like Asbury, like United Theological Seminary, which has a very solid faculty, and some others would be encouraged. Okay. You want to come down here?
I'm hearing a lot about money, power, and that bothers me immensely. But money seems to be driving where people are going, apportionments, and I am not knowledgeable about these things, but money corrupts.
It absolutely does. I'd be happy to try to respond to your comment and in the way I'm understanding it. I too believe that this should not be a money-driven decision. You can't avoid addressing money, but so in the negotiations that led to the Indianapolis plan, others wanted to address what was going to happen to the resources of the church first, and if we did that, that would result in us not getting anywhere. And so they agreed with me to put that off to the very end. There are really three levels of finances that are important here. The resources of local churches, your buildings, the resources that you have. It's a fair proposition to say that each church ought to keep the buildings that they occupy. They ought to keep their resources. The reality is it's the people who are part of those churches that have built those churches. Yes, they were United Methodists or they were Methodist churches, but understand the trust clause is Mr. Wesley created it so that there would be a way to ensure that sound doctrine was taught from the pulpit in that church. And so if you had some person show up to preach and they preached another gospel, thank you, they preached another gospel, Mr. Wesley could come in and say, this is a Methodist pulpit, and you're out of here. Okay, but that's not the way the trust clause is used in our time. It's been weaponized, okay? Now, I'm sorry. I'm a lawyer, and you give me an opportunity, and I'm going to make my argument, okay? But hear this. The value of all the United Methodist churches throughout our denomination is $62 billion, okay? And so if we divide that up according to what each church, and they get to keep it, the money goes, that's not a money issue for us anymore, and it's handled in a fair way. The second biggest money issue is the pension liability owed to pastors who have served the church and to whom the church made promises, and there's retirement obligations there. Now, a lot of that is already funded. It's already funded, and that money is held by Westpath, our pension agency. And if there's any agency of the church that everyone believes and affirms does a great job, it's Westpath. Okay, they're persons of integrity, and they've done their job well, and those assets are there. And so those pension funds will be distributed to those pastors, and there's a portion of our pension obligations that are unfunded, and they'll be funded by any successor denominations. So that's not a point of contention. So the only remaining financial contention that I know of are the assets of the general church. Now, when I say the number, and by the way, they're not the assets of the United Methodist Church because the United Methodist Church is not a legal entity. You may not know that. It's an association of churches, of conferences and all of that. But they're assets of the general boards and agencies of our church, okay? The number that is there is a big number. None of us probably ever operate in this way, but remember this $62 billion number. It's $1 billion, okay? Now, about 300 million of that is buildings. There's a building in Washington called the United Methodist Building. In Nashville, there's the General Board of Discipleship. In Atlanta, there's the General Board of Global Ministry. Those are fixed assets, and no one is proposing that they be fire sold, okay? Then there's another about 250 or so million that are endowments and donor-restricted funds. They have to be used according to their legal terms. So there's really no argument over how those assets will ultimately be deployed. And so when you cut through it all, we're talking about $162 million in undesignated resources, which, by the way, is a lot of money to everybody here in this room. But do you see here's how small that is in compared to all the other things we've already addressed. So I would tell you that I do not believe that ultimately this fight and what is holding us together and keeping us from resolving it is over money. I believe it's over power in one sense, okay? Those who are in power don't want to give up that power. People whose careers have been built around this, who have positions like their bishops or whatever, they're fighting to keep that power. And I don't think that ought to control the decision here. We're a church. So anyway, I hope that's helpful. Back here, okay, and then there's someone here and there's people over here too. You got David, I'll come over to you next. Go ahead.
David Shoemaker, clergy.
Yes.
I feel like I need to say which district. Tupelo district. As I look around the room, y'all will forgive me for noticing that at this gathering, we're predominantly white, and most of us have a fair bit of gray hair, at least what's left.
Or we're using dye.
Or we're using dye.
Yeah.
Sorry, Stephen. What is the response to the WCA across racial lines that you're seeing, and how is the WC going to continue the inclusion and promotion of women and minorities
Thank you.
in leadership and in ministry in the church moving forward?
Thank you very much for that question. I personally am very committed to the diversity of our church, gender and ethnically. And so I have devoted a considerable amount of my time to reaching out to and meeting with various ethnic groups within our church. If you're on Twitter, you will know that the Association of Korean United Methodist Churches, at a meeting in early September, and these are the 275 largest Korean-speaking churches in the United Methodist Church, voted unanimously to join the WCA and to align with a new traditional denomination. That comes as a result of 3 years of meetings with them and lots of travel and time spent with them, and is because of my commitment to wanting to reach ethnic groups within our church. I've had similar meetings with African American leaders in the church. The president of the Mississippi Black Methodists for Church Renewal is a member of our global WCA Council, Fitzgerald Lovett. We specifically approached him and other African American leaders, asking them to step into leadership positions. We have an African American female clergy person on our global WCA board, Dr. Joy Moore. We also have a millennial layperson, African American, from the Eastern Pennsylvania Conference, Crystal Johnson, who serves on our WCA Council. I've also met with the Haitian communities, met with them for a full day in Florida. They are, many of them have joined. One of their leaders is on the WCA Global Council, Montreal Millard. I've also met with leaders of the Hispanic, Latina caucus, and there are strong leaders there who are associated with the WCA, and some of them are also on our board as well. So you find the same divisions in those ethnic groups as you do in the general church. And so when the Association of Korean Churches came out with their statement, immediately there were 3 progressive Korean groups that showed up that never had existed before, and they're announcing, their opposition to the WCA. But we're making every effort to reach out to the ethnic community. Now, in terms of women, you should know from everything we've said and written and done that we fully support the leadership of women in our church at every level, including as pastors, as lay leadership, all of that. Our vice chair of our council is Carolyn Moore. We have, I should have counted the number of women on our council, but we have a number of women on our council. We frequently feature them as writers of important articles for our e-newsletter. And so there's no question in the leadership of the WCA that women are equal partners with men in this endeavor, and we will remain fully committed to that. The final thing I would say there is, and this may take me down a little bit of a lengthy conversation, so I'll try to make it brief, and then if someone wants to ask more, they can. But the most important area where we have an opportunity to address this is in clergy deployment, okay? By clergy deployment, I mean the assignment of pastors to serve churches. It is highly unlikely that any denominational system will be able to sustain a commitment to guaranteed appointments in the future. It is economically unsustainable. And so it is offering a false hope to say, oh, we're going to have guaranteed appointments, and therefore it's going to take care of these kinds of issues. So rather than play that game and then not be able to deliver on it, we're very clear. There will not be guaranteed appointments in what we're recommending. But we have proposed that in the clergy deployment system, there be a commitment to what we're calling the Hosier Rule, and it's named after Harry Hosier, who was an African-American pastor who rode circuit with Francis Asbury, and many people believe he was a better preacher than Mr. Asbury. But the Hosier Rule requires that in any clergy deployment situation that there be at least one woman considered out of a possible 5, and at least one person who is of an ethnicity different than the predominant ethnicity of that congregation. So it seeks to, and they're not limited to one, it can be more, but it ensures opportunity. And hey, I know lots of women pastors, and I know lots of ethnic pastors, and they can hold their own in any setting when they're given the opportunity. So and we will teach and advocate for that kind of inclusion in everything we do. Very high commitment to that. We cannot continue to be a church that is aging, so we have to focus on millennials. We have to focus. The future of the United States is not going to be Caucasian. We're going to be increasingly a smaller percentage of the overall population, and so a church which limits its outreach to Caucasians is going to be a dying church. We have to recognize, and by the way, God didn't call us to reach our racial group. He called us to reach everybody. And so if we're going to be faithful to the gospel, the call of gospel, we got to do it. And I'm sorry, now I've gone to preaching.
Keith, we need to go into a 2-minute drill. So some rapid fire questions and answer, just to hear from as many as we can.
Okay.
I have just a couple of questions
Sure.
related to each church, like you said, either the charge conference or the
Church conference.
and ones that may have a little conflict that the church members themselves. In a church that might not be as open as ours, how is there a process for members to realize what's going on to where charge conference might not need to take that situation and the church might vote that the people have the opportunity? What process, or how do they find out in churches that aren't explained all this?
Sure. And I'll try to make my answer really quick.
And then I have one other question.
Yes.
On the churches that we've lost, like our Get Well Method, people that have broken off, what's being done to maybe, if the Indianapolis plan goes through, to pull them back in under the traditional?
Okay. I'll try to give you a quick answer to both of those things. In most churches, the pastor is the gatekeeper. If the pastor doesn't permit information to get in, it's very hard to get that information in. We are funded, the WCA is funded by memberships. 20% of our budget this fiscal year has been allocated to fund a public relations campaign to get information to local churches. We're going to use every vehicle we can to help local churches get that information. We have a network of leaders like the Mississippi WCA that will be ready, will help them get ready to go into local churches and answer questions. But ultimately, it's going to be incumbent on the lay people of each church to get the information they need. We'll make it available, but that's it. Now, the second thing, what about churches that have left? Some of those churches that have left were not part of the WCA to begin with. In fact, the only one here in Mississippi that's left that was a member of the WCA at the time of its departure was the Orchard. Okay, but I am in I constantly reach out to pastors of churches who have left to invite them to be part of what's next, and we are eager for them to be at the table when we get there. And some of them have indicated an openness to do that. People get to this place at different points in time, and our rule is we want to be gracious and generous to people whenever they have reached that point of departure. So, all right.
I'm Erica Creech. I came down from the Memphis Annual Conference.
Welcome.
Thank you. If anyone's here from that, please see me after.
Anyone from Memphis Conference?
Oh,
you're the
wasn't
lone.
that far?
You're the lone person, but you're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for your work and everything. Okay, here's my question. After the St. Louis conference, I watched the Memphis Annual Conference and the annual conference season, which we fell in line. They had an organized and elected across the board pretty much centrist clergy and lay. If you could put on your hat, predictive hat, say the Indianapolis plan passes, would you see any benefit in some sort of internet campaign or person-to-person campaign with the annual conference delegates to vote their conscience or to go to their people to people and make a vote on this annual conference decision? I think it's going to be very close in our conference. What are your thoughts?
Sure. Well, I can tell you that my proposal in the negotiations of the Indianapolis plan was that we allowed every Methodist, who's a person who's a member, to cast a vote for the annual conference. That we empower every Methodist. No delegates. Well, you can understand how that got responded to. They didn't like that. So there's something called equalization delegates. You have clergy appointed beyond the local church, and they have to be equalized by lay people, and that is manipulated in many annual conferences. So the Indianapolis plan addresses that by requiring that equalization delegates be elected and that no more than one come from every church. or that no church can have more equalization delegates than they have delegates to annual conference. We will seek. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. No, I'm talking about that one. I'm talking about that one in June. If your annual conference, the equalization delegates are going to be important. Okay, and then the second thing, the final thing in that regard is, in many annual conferences, small membership churches are not represented at the conference session because they do not send a lay delegate, or their delegate does not stay through the lengthy business sessions and aren't present when these votes are taken. So it's going to be incumbent upon all of us to use our influence to speak to those churches and those delegates to encourage them to be present when this important vote is taken. So we'll try to do that. Where are you? Okay.
You all try to make it quick. I'm Smith Lilly, clergy person in Mississippi here. It seems to me that one of the things that we have lost is not just sort of a historic and consistent understanding of our doctrine, but sort of our practices too, especially when it comes to things like class meetings, band meetings, and small group discipleship. So my question is, how do you envision the WCA or whatever follow-on that we have making that sort of a key feature of Methodist life?
Sure.
I'll hang up and listen.
That's great. You're right. The real challenge for us as a movement is not what's happening in the United Methodist Church now, or how we resolve any separation, or even what the polity is necessarily going forward. What's wrong with us as Methodists is much deeper than that, okay? It's that we have lost I'm just going to be blunt. It's that we've lost our love of Jesus as a movement, okay? And we have accommodated to the culture. We have abandoned disciple making and discipleship. You didn't ask for all this, I'm sorry, but this is exactly okay. And so I mean, it's time for us to get real with our faith and with our people, okay, and to present the beauty of a surrendered life to Christ, and to challenge people to put their full trust and confidence in the Lord, and to help people realize that you can't be spoon-fed or force-fed the Christian faith, that it is the development of a relationship that means that you spend time and that you make yourself open to the work of the Holy Spirit. And that absolutely includes the kind of accountable discipleship that you're talking about. And so at the very top of our list of things that we want to see happen is a renewed, revitalized, re-envisioned discipleship initiative that includes class meetings or other accountable discipleship sorts of things. So there will be 3 general resolutions that will come to the Global Legislative Assembly. One will be that we will present the Book of Doctrine and Discipline and ask the Global Legislative Assembly to receive and commend it for further study. The second will be asking the Global Legislative Assembly to endorse amicable separation and the principles of the Indianapolis Plan. And the third will be the creation of a whole series of working groups to address the kinds of things that you're talking about so that we hit the ground running as a new movement. And if you would pick up my card out there and email me, and you're interested in being part of one of those working groups, or anyone else here, please email me and your name will be put in the hopper for that, okay? Thanks. Who's got, oh, here we go, right here. He's going to want to get you the microphone because they are recording this. Do you believe that? I am answering these kinds of questions so the whole world can hear it.
I don't know if this...
Am I crazy? Go ahead.
I'm crazy. I don't know if this is an appropriate question to ask in this setting, but I was wondering if you could give us some idea how this situation can impact the retirement homes that we support, and also the names Methodist Church the Methodist name on hospitals and so on, how would that differentiate?
Sure. That's a very complicated question because it really depends upon the legal ownership of those institutions. So some retirement homes that have the name Methodist on it are just basically using that name, and they aren't the assets of the United Methodist Church or of an annual conference. They're completely independent. The same with some of the hospitals and other institutions like that. So what is happening here would not impact them at all. Okay. Now there are some institutions like that that are owned by annual conferences, that are owned by other parts of the church, and if their ownership is affiliated to an annual conference, then the ownership of those institutions would travel with whatever that annual conference elects to align with. In terms of distinguishing, the Indianapolis plan would permit but not require each of the new denominations to use the United Methodist name with an appropriate modifier. Now, most people that I talk to in the traditional wing of the church have no interest in being known as the United Methodist Church anymore. But I feel certain that the name will probably include the word Methodist, but it'll be very clear in terms of distinguishing us from other parts of this conflict. In Africa, the United Methodist Church name is very important. And so my conversations with our African brothers and sisters are that they would like to align with the traditional church, but they would like to continue to be known as the United Methodist Church of Africa because of its importance there. And they'll have that option under the Indianapolis plan.
You know, I think for the sake of time, if you don't mind, come to Keith afterwards. We're kind of pushing our closing time, so Keith will be available afterwards for further conversation.
So if I could just thank everybody, and then I'll turn it over to you. I'm really grateful for your presence here. I don't ask that you agree with me. In fact, I don't expect you're going to agree with everything that I've said, but I'm more than willing to engage you and listen and try to hear what you're saying and for us to try to be responsive to it. I love this church. I know you love this church. And I want to see us be the vibrant church that John Wesley envisioned to continue down through the ages. Pick up my business card out there. It's got my email. It's got my personal cell phone on it. That's how much I want to connect with you. I will get back to you as quickly as possible, given human limitation. But if you have a question, I want you to call me and I'll discuss it with you. And I will be here, Hugh, for whatever amount of time. I don't know who's taking me to Memphis. Maybe I'm riding with you to Memphis. I don't know. But whoever's taking me to Memphis, as long as they are willing to wait and let me answer questions, I'll stay here until that time is up. Thank you very much. I appreciate you.
Well, friends, we're going to wrap up with a moment of worship and then a song and share communion together. But may I direct us back to Hezekiah. This is from Isaiah 37. Because of the passionate commitment of the Lord of Heaven's armies, here's what was promised to Hezekiah. A turnaround, a slow turnaround, but a turnaround. That in the first year, you will eat only what grows up by itself. The next year, you will eat what springs up from that. But in the third year, you will plant crops and harvest them. You will tend vineyards and eat their fruit. You will put down roots in your own soil and grow up and flourish. We share the hope that was extended to Hezekiah. So let's close by sharing in the prayer of Hezekiah. When he received the bad news letter, he spread it out before the Lord. So let us walk through the prayer of Hezekiah. And would you join as we pray this prayer? First, would you just begin facing the reality? If it's frustration you feel, call it what it is to the Lord. If it's anger that you feel, if it's disillusionment that you feel, call it what it is to the Lord. If it's an inability to affect change, then express that to the Lord. Even confess ways that we have been part of the problem. The first words of prayer that Hezekiah prayed were words of praise. So let's join him in that. Hezekiah prayed, "O Lord, you are enthroned between the mighty cherubim. You alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You alone created the heavens and the earth. You alone, O Lord. It is to you we look." And then Hezekiah made his request before the Lord. He said, "Bend down and listen, open your eyes and see. Come to us and rescue us from this dark time." As we face the reality of a corporate dark night of the soul, call on the Lord to come, to see, to bend down, to listen, to rescue. And then the hope that was extended to Hezekiah, may we claim that for ourselves. Maybe a slow turnaround, but a turnaround for sure. Claim the hope that we will put down roots in our own soil and we will grow up and flourish, because the passionate commitment of the Lord of Heaven's armies will make this happen. Come, Lord Jesus, by the power of your Holy Spirit, we offer the prayer of Hezekiah, and we offer this prayer in the name of Jesus.